So we need to become textual experts. We need to know how cohesion works, how coherence works, what language functions are used in texts. So let me suggest that we focus on three main language functions. And Christiane Nord defines these functions, which she borrows from Buehler, thus. She says, and I quote, "A function is to be understood here as," and it's important for you to remember this because we are focusing on textual or linguistic functions. We are not talking about the function of the translation. We are just talking about what texts are written for, what is the intended use of a certain text. She quotes, I quote, Nord here. She says, "The use a receiver makes of a text or the meaning that the text has for the receiver." So if I write a text and I send this text to a target group of readers, how do they take that text? How do they use it? What do they understand by this text that has been given to them? So we can, there are three main functions, three main intended uses of a text. The first one is called appellative. In this case, we're using verbal or non-verbal communicative signs to obtain a certain response or reaction from the receiver. We want someone to do something. Sometimes they're also called operative or conative, and they also have their own some sub-functions. But in order to simplify things, let's just focus on appellative. A text is appellative when the intended meaning or purpose or use of this text is to persuade somebody to act upon it. A typical example, or typical examples of appellative text would be the ad, or the railway ad. Cualquier estación es buena para viajar en tren. We want people, hopefully, to respond and use trains more often. So promotional texts, marketing texts are an excellent example of an appellative text. Political speeches. "Vote for me," said one candidate. "No, vote for me," said the other. So political speech would be an appellative text. Then we have what we call, or Buehler and Nord call, expressive texts. Expressive texts, and I quote, include a relationship of equal communicative signs to manifest a person's feelings or attitude towards the objects or phenomena of the world. They elicit feelings, emotional or emotive responses in readers. So we have, for instance, jokes, humorous texts, or comic strips, or sitcoms. Those are, that's an example of feelings. Also, you can find aesthetic texts in which the language is used for as an end in itself, with aesthetic purposes, like poetry, literature. So expressive texts are there to generate emotion by the use of language or nonverbal elements. And then we have what we call phatic or referential, or for simplicity's sake, we can call it informative. Texts that use verbal and nonverbal signs to refer to objects or phenomena of the world, or a specific world or context or subject. Examples of text like this could be a Wikipedia article. We're going to find information, dates, names, events, data. So information is key in phatic or referential or informative texts. And we have certain sub-categories. For instance, informative, facts, state of affairs unknown to the reader, like news, data. Or metalinguistic, for instance, if you look up a description of a certain language in a grammar book. So the metalinguistic function would be the use of language to describe language. In grammar books, we find that. Directive texts would be texts including instructions like recipes or user manuals. See, they give you steps to achieve a certain result or complete a certain process. Didactic texts in a certain field of learning, we look at a textbook. The textbook includes the didactic function because they are teaching us a subject, specialized subject. So these three main textual functions, are they isolated or self-contained? No. We could find a text that has a combination of all three, or has a dominant function and maybe a sub-function. So we could find a text that is mainly referential or informative, and then has an appellative component to it, but it's not the dominant function. Or we could find a poem that it's also informational, or a poem that is also appellative. So with this description in mind, appellative, expressive, or phatic, let's see some examples. I have a few texts here, and the idea will be to identify what functions do these texts have in your view. Are they appellative? Are they expressive? Are they informative? And why? Do you have any, can you find any textual markers, any linguistic or non-linguistic elements in the texts that actually point to or provide you with the evidence you need to identify them as such, or to identify the functions as such? So what are the intended uses of these texts? Let's have a look at the texts. Text 1 is a comic strip. So pause the video and contemplate for a second. What do you think about this? What function or functions do you find here, and why? Yes, this comic strip, we would say that this text is mainly expressive because it is intended to create laughter, or is a humorous text which is intended to fulfill, to transfer, to convey the attitudes of the author regarding the world and maybe elicit certain emotions in the reader. We find a combination of text. We also have a combination of situational components because we see animals that are attributed the human endowment of thought and reflection. We are also looking at drawings. So the combination of text, drawings, we see that this is a comic strip. We recognize the elements, the clear elements of a textual genre. So it's clear that we have a mainly expressive text in our hands with text 1. Text 2, we have an ad. We have an ad for a certain luxury product, in this case a watch. So the same thing, stop the video and try to think, is this an appellative text? Is it an informative text? Is it an expressive text? Why? What evidence from the actual text can you single out as the basis for your decision? Yes, you would be right in saying that this advert, just by virtue of the textual genre, is an appellative text. The authors of the text, the senders, intend people to become aware of this product they are offering, and hopefully they intend to foster or induce people to purchase the object or the item. We have a combination of images, obviously from the item, worn on the wrist, and then if you thought that this information, then you were right. I would say that one way of looking at this text from a functional standpoint is to say that this text has a dominant function, which is the appellative function, because it's meant to induce or to invite the reader to purchase the product. So it's persuasive in that regard, so it's appellative, and that would be the dominant function. But then we have a secondary function, because we have information as well. If you look at the text carefully, you see the power of precision. We have a slogan there with a triplock, winding crown, and a unidirectional rotatable bezel. The Rolex Submariner is a timepiece 1,000 feet above. So we have information. It's not a lot, it's not technical specs, but at least they're giving us some information in which they describe the product. So we have the phatic or referential function as well. Just a combination of the two, but the dominant function will be the appellative. Text 3, the user manual. What do you think? What function and what evidence do you have? Stop the video and think for a minute. Take some notes if you like. Yes, a user manual would be in this case an informative text, and the sub variety or sub function in this case will be directive, because we are being given instructions on how to use a certain product, in this case how to charge and change the battery in one of those old-fashioned cell phones. We have the steps, we have verbs that are written in and directed to the reader. See clearly, do this, do that, align, insert. We have the format also clearly establishes the steps with bullet points that you can and numbered steps or stages, and we also have non-verbal elements, these diagrams describing the product and how to with those arrows they point at how to handle the product in order to achieve the desired result. So yes, we have a clearly referential product in this case, an informative, didactic text. And finally, I think this is the last one, text 4, a poem, The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverge in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So this famous poem, The Road Not Taken, what do you think about the function attribution to this poem? Stop the video and think for a second. Say what you think. Yes, so in this case we have the road not taken could be construed. Obviously, we look at the way the text is arranged. We have versification in this case. We have a title, so we clearly have a poem in our hands. We recognize the markers. We recognize the conventions of the textual genre, the type of text we have, and we know it's poetry. So obviously we are going to link and recognize the use of a certain textual genre, a text type, to a certain typical function. So in this case, we obviously have the use of language in a poetic way. So we have expressive function. Someone would say, well, we also have information in here because we have a story, an individual who comes to a crossroads and sees two roads. And then we also might look between the lines and even say that we have an appellative poem because they are inviting us to do something, to make certain decisions in life and to look at life in a certain way. So this poem is an interesting text in the sense that one can argue that we find traces of all three functions in a single text type, on a single text specimen, being the expressive function the dominant one, because this is a poem and language is used in a special way. Good. There was another one, textbook. Think about a textbook. In this case, we don't need to read it because we can anticipate certain components of a textbook, and you are an expert in textbooks because you've been dealing with textbooks in college. So stop the video and think for a minute, what do you think the main function is in this specimen, this example, textbook, text 5? Yes, we have a didactic text because they are teaching us about a certain subject, and it's a referential text. The subcategory will be didactic because it's clearly a pedagogical text. So we have the information is what counts in a text like this, and textbooks would have that main. The goal of transferring information would be the overarching goal or aim by the sender of the text, and that has to be borne in mind by anyone approaching the translation. So in this case, I think it's important to look at the textual functions and identify the textual functions. And remember, and we will mention this later on again in the semester, in the block, that these textual functions typically will be the same or will be shared or will be equivalent between the source text and the target text. But we need to make sure that this is the case before we translate a certain text. We need to know if the sender of the text, if the commissioner of the translation wants us to recreate an informative text as is, or if we are going to be tampering with or changing the textual function. But by knowing the textual function of the text, we are going to be able to anticipate a lot of things about the text. We're going to be able to anticipate what kinds of format the text is going to have, what kinds of style, tone. A lot of information can be anticipated by the translator when we know that the source text has a certain function, and that function, appellative, informative, or expressive, needs to be recreated or not in the target text. Good. So if we continue towards the end of this first part, we're going to be looking at the basic features of translation and different approaches to the translation, to the definition of translation. In this case, we see, for instance, translation as a cognitive act. So certain translation definitions are going to underline the cognitive component of translation. Others are going to be looking at translation from a linguistic standpoint. It's a linguistic process in which we analyze a source text and then we transfer those source text and source language utterances, examples of use, and we transform them to create new acceptable utterances, texts in the target language, in the target culture. Others are going to be looking at translation from the point of view of hermeneutics, from the point of view of interpretation. Translation is about interpreting a message. Then after we have understood the message, we transfer the message into a different language with or without certain levels of transformation. Others are going to be looking at translation, and this is obviously number 4 is the one that permeates, underlies a lot of this course, of the units, the theory approaches and the practical approaches to translation in this block. Some will look at translation from the point of view of a human action with a purpose, and they will look at the ways in which we can create new texts or translations that have a purpose and that fulfill that purpose that was stated from the start. Others are going to be looking at translation from a professional or industrial workflow with a job commissioned by a customer or client that needs to be executed, and a translation needs to be a product or a deliverable of that commission, and in exchange of which we receive a payment. We will come back to the process of translation later on in one of the units that come. We will look into the translation process as such. Look,